So I'm currently reading this book, Trauma Spectrum: Hidden Wounds and Human Resiliency by Robert Scaer, foreword by Peter Levine. And Robert Scaer explains how very small things can traumatize people depending on how they grew up. And there is this thing called kindling or internal cues. When internal cues of trauma become part of the source of arousal related to a specific traumatic event, a process called neurosensitization or kindling takes place. Taken from the word for wood that burns easily, the term kindling refers to a process of neurosensitization within neural pathways that leads to spontaneous activity that is independent of external sensory stimulation. Kindling may also explain the tendency for painful body symptoms and associated emotions to actually worsen with the passage of time, almost as if they had a life of their own. In cases of trauma and learned helplessness, the brain and body are literally on automatic pilot, following pathways of old survival cues that warn of long past threats. First a Scaer to warn the unwitting victim of the original trauma. These cues now trigger useless reflexive self-protective motor responses, pain, or other intense sensory experiences and emotional states disproportionate to the current experience. And each time these old cues elicit arousal, they up the ante, increasing the self-protective response to the perceived threat and rendering the victim increasingly sensitive to them. Eventually, the trauma victim may respond to almost any ambient excessive environmental stimulus, such as smells, loud noises, or flashes of light. Conditioned associations such as these may be extremely subtle and revealed only after a thorough exploration of the meaning of the patient's response has been conducted. Such deeply rooted conditioned associations have a great deal to do with how we view the world through the clear lens of safety or through the murky glass of danger. From preferences to phobias, our life choices are often influenced by procedural memories for old, unremembered, and supposedly trivial life trauma. The myriad environmental cues stored in our unconscious memory shape our personalities, preferences, and social behaviors. They are deeply learned habits, both good and bad, and changing them is difficult at best. On the negative side, they limit the breadth of our behavior options and may not only be self-perpetuating but also lead to more symptoms. In such cases, the body sensations representing old traumatic procedural memory may themselves serve as a message of threat, eliciting low-grade arousal as part of fight-flight preparation. Images, explicit memories, and other internal cues to the original trauma may also trigger the cycle of neuronal connections that initiate the brain's neurophysiological cycle of arousal. The quantum shift in endocrine and immune responses resulting from these so-called trivial events may sow the seeds of many common somatic diseases and emotional disorders throughout the lifespan. Diseases of stress and trauma. Stress and trauma have much in common as bad things that happen to a person during the course of his or her life. I've basically defined traumas as an experience that involves a threat to life while the victim is in a state of relative helplessness. By now it should be clear that trauma itself exists on a continuum and that many events that ordinarily would not be considered life-threatening can be traumatic, depending on their meaning within the context of the victim's prior life experiences. Stress, as we know, is any force of nature or experience that disrupts the psychological equilibrium, homeostasis of an animal or person. Because trauma disrupts homeostasis, it falls under the category of stress. But obviously, not all stress is traumatic. Basically, the two states, like most everything else, form a continuum. Stress may become traumatic if it occurs in the face of helplessness or lack of control, especially if features of the stressful experience contain cues related to past life trauma. Both types of experiences potentially impair one's health. How they impair it and how they differ in the process of doing so is important to understand. Most researchers consider many of the medical syndromes covered in this chapter to be psychosomatic in nature. Some physicians believe that stress produces symptoms that may, in a sense, be real but don't actually constitute a disease. Others think that stress-related symptoms are largely imagined. Typical. And then they tell you, oh, it's all in your mind, blah, blah, blah. However, Dr. Robert Scaer says, I believe that the symptoms of these diseases and disorders are the very real consequences of the effects of traumatic stress on the body. Thus, diseases of trauma basically fall on a continuum, with those related to the fight-flight response, which usually are the same as stress-related diseases on one end of the continuum, and those related to helplessness, the freeze response, and dissociation on the other end. course, no creature is entirely immune to states of helplessness. Furthermore, helplessness has many meanings, and at times remarkably subtle criteria: entrapment, imprisonment, disempowerment, defenselessness, vulnerability, and weakness, for example, could all be considered forms of helplessness. Each of these states implies a relative lack of control, but by itself would not necessarily be considered a risk factor for trauma. Nevertheless, as I have repeatedly noted, the events that may be considered traumatic also form a continuum. Trauma, to a great extent, is dependent on the meaning of the event to the individual based on the person's cumulative burden of negative life experiences and on the similarity of the event to any of those experiences. Where the person falls within the spectrum of states of relative helplessness is also determined by this cumulative burden of prior negative life experiences. Helplessness, therefore, is contingent upon the individual's relative state of resiliency or vulnerability, both of which are determined not only by the real effects of prior negative life experience, but also by the person's perception of those experiences. One of the most common sources of life stress in an urbanized, accumulated society is the approach avoidance conflict, in which one's options have both positive and negative implications for one's sense of well-being. Obviously, the greater the intensity of these implications, the greater the conflict will be, and the greater the intensity of ambivalence. It is not uncommon that one must make life choices that have actual implications for survival. Given this state of culturally determined physiological inhibition, humans are likely to freeze dissociate fairly frequently. This tendency to freeze occurs not only during major traumatic events, but also with the experience of unavoidable and irresolvable conflict. If the person is the victim of accumulated complex trauma, the freeze may occur with trivial life events whose meaning is sufficient to represent a life threat. If the person is unable to routinely and effectively discharge the freeze, the physiological events that occur in the brain and endocrine and autonomic nervous systems associated in response to trauma and freeze will occur repeatedly. The intensity of this response will be proportionate to the intensity of the threat or conflict. At times, the autonomic nervous system may manifest marked accentuation of activity in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, as when the prey has frozen after a failed attempt to flee. As a result, one may see diseases and conditions with symptoms that appear diametrically opposed to each other at both ends of autonomic function in the same patient. Patients with irritable bowel syndrome usually experience alternating constipation and diarrhea. Because these regulatory systems affect every organ system in the body, the patient may present with disabling symptoms affecting multiple organs and regions of the body, a condition that defies the allopathic system of concepts. It is no wonder that the diseases of freeze dissociation are perplexing and are often considered to be the result of hypochondria or psychosomatic or somatization disorders. Yeah, and then you feel invalidated and gaslit. For purposes of discussion, I have divided these diseases into categories based on the predominant feature of their abnormal function. These categories are as follows. Diseases of abnormal autonomic regulation. Syndromes of procedural memory. Diseases of somatic dissociation. Disorders of endocrine and immune system regulation. Disorders of cognition and sleep. As with any categories related to a common cause, the conditions addressed in part will fall along a continuum. Consequently, virtually all of these disease categories contain some similar clinical characteristics and symptoms and a similar basic physiology. Diseases of abnormal autonomic regulation. The most prominent feature of altered autonomic regulation in trauma and dissociation is a dramatic and abnormal enhancement of the normal oscillatory cycling of homeostasis. The model of learned helplessness in animals typifies this response. This pattern of response is especially common in PTSD victims who have childhood trauma or have suffered exposure to many episodes of traumatic stress, a condition now referred to as complex trauma. Such persons may be said to be primed to dissociate, and they may intermittently experience many different perceptual states that are typical of dissociation, such as episodes of depersonalization, amnesia, altered sense of time, and feelings of unreality. With this degree of sensitization of threat, the freeze response occurs frequently and persists for longer periods of time. Such a person will therefore spend a great deal of time with the perceptual symptoms of dissociation and will experience a state of chronic and heightened parasympathetic autonomic tone, alternating of course with briefer periods of arousal or sympathetic tone. The state of sustained freeze dissociation is also associated with persisting abnormally low levels of serum cortisol. When the parasympathetic nervous system is operating in a healthy fashion, the animal is at rest, often having eaten or procreated. Food is actively being digested. Glucose stores are being accumulated in the form of glycogen In the muscles and liver, the muscles are resting and replenishing energy. Much of this activity is driven by impulses from the vagus nerve. Located in the brainstem medulla, the vagus nerve also regulates the parasympathetic activity of the viscera of the thorax and abdomen. In a parasympathetic dominant state, the digestive organs are quite active, with the stomach and intestines contracting in peristalsis and the glands of digestion secreting enzymes. The diseases discussed in this section of the book are primarily parasympathetic in dominance and are related to freeze and dissociation. However, one must remember that these conditions also may be with manifestations of exaggerated sympathetic tone, causing a perplexing fluctuation of symptoms. In fact, most of the diseases of trauma are characterized by this vexing tendency for bimodal and unpredictable symptoms. I believe that a number of well-known but perplexing diseases are prototypes for abnormal function of the parasympathetic vagal nervous system in freeze dissociation. These diseases are characterized by fatigue and weakness, as well as by hyperactive function of the viscera controlling digestion and excretion of wastes, stomach, intestines, bladder, digestive glands. Cognitive symptoms, emotional symptoms, and sleep disturbance combine with these visceral problems to form a group of symptoms that suggest an abnormal state of function of the parasympathetic nervous system and brain endorphins. Abnormal control of the regulation of the heart and of circulation. Vasomotor function is often a prominent problem. Abdominal visceral symptoms accompany many of these syndromes. Symptoms of allergies or hypersensitivity are common. As with all of these diseases of trauma, pain is an almost constant companion. Fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. Fibromyalgia is a well-known syndrome, constituting about 5% of the general medical population and about 20% of the population seen in rheumatology clinics. If you ask rheumatologists about whether there really is such a disease, they will invariably agree that it indeed exists, but scratch their heads in frustration about its unpredictable nature and resistance to treatment. Many physicians will deny its existence as a true disease. Chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS, is so commonly associated with fibromyalgia that many physicians describe them as one syndrome. However, debilitating chronic fatigue may occur independently of the diffuse skeletal pain of fibromyalgia, and many researchers have chosen to separate the two syndromes. Nevertheless, because CFS is associated with many of the diffuse and separate conditions linked to fibromyalgia, I feel that it is appropriate to consider the two syndromes as parts of a continuum rather than as separate conditions. The primary symptoms of fibromyalgia are diffuse skeletal pain, widespread points of tenderness over the surface of the body, morning stiffness, daytime fatigue, and interrupted, non-restorative sleep. Common symptoms also include scattered areas of numbness and tingling, hypervigilance, and emotional instability, cognitive impairment, and dizziness. This skeletal pain is cyclical and unpredictable in nature, although it is generally made worse by emotional stress. Not surprised about that. Physical activity and cold or wet weather. It is often improved, although not abolished, by local heat. Virtually all fibromyalgia patients experience daytime fatigue and weakness. This is specifically associated with awakening, feeling stiff, tired, and unrefreshed, although insomnia per se is not a primary problem. Nevertheless, many fibromyalgia patients experience delayed sleep onset and multiple awakening episodes, often due to skeletal pain. Fatigue is severe enough to result in almost involuntary collapse at times. I've treated a number of patients for dramatic symptoms of collapse, during which they suddenly lose all strength and literally sink to the ground, lying there for long periods of time and unable to force themselves to get up and go to a couch or bed. All of these patients have had significant recent trauma, and the collapse is in the context of other trauma-related symptoms. Most have experienced a state of entrapment or irresolvable approach avoidance conflict. Several have had concomitant visceral hyperactivity symptoms, and several definite fibromyalgia. I believe that the weakness and collapse that is seen in fibromyalgia and other post-traumatic states relates to the parasympathetic immobility of the freeze response. And you see this also in autistic catatonia, which is always triggered by stress. It's just the same parasympathetic response to stress. Migraine. Migraine is an extremely common syndrome occurring in about 1 in 10 people, 2/3 of whom are female. It clearly has a strong genetic basis, and although stress is known to be perhaps the most potent trigger for migraine, it is a bit of a stretch to include it specifically under diseases of post-traumatic autonomic dysregulation. The physiological mechanisms for migraine continue to be studied, but its clinical symptoms provide a remarkable model for very specific abnormalities of the regulation of autonomic function. In migraine, that abnormality primarily affects the blood vessels of the head and brain. Based on recent findings and theories, migraine is probably a disorder of abnormal neurotransmitter function, especially involving norepinephrine and serotonin. It also involves specific brain centers, most prominently the locus coeruleus, which initiates the arousal response. In classical migraine, clinical symptoms are characterized by a period of constriction of blood vessels in the head and brain, with abnormalities of brain function that cause symptoms reminiscent of a stroke. These symptoms are usually one-sided and may include numbness, clumsiness, bright visual flashes with visual impairment, scotoma, impaired speech, and confusion. Light sensitivity is another one. After 15 to 20 minutes, the patient usually experiences a headache, sometimes relatively mild, but often excruciating. That is commonly on the opposite side of the body's neurological symptoms. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and physical debility are the general rule, with debility lasting from hours to days. And it's torture if it lasts for days. Migraine, then, is a dramatic example of marked autonomic dysregulation, involving both sympathetic and parasympathetic clinical manifestations and presenting primarily with symptoms arising from cyclically altered blood circulation of the head and brain. Migraine victims may find that their headaches are precipitated by certain foods. Yes, I used to have that. Which is why I then connected that to histamine intolerance and sulfur intolerance and, well, some others. And then, such as cheeses. Cheeses are no longer an issue for me. Nuts, I don't eat nuts because I'm carnivore. Alcohol is not an issue. Well, I don't drink red wine, but occasionally beer. It's not an issue. Many of which contain a substance called tyramine, a chemical related to serotonin. Sleep deprivation, oh yeah, every time. Stress, yes. The higher the stress, the more migraines I used to get, and now the quality of life has improved, and I no longer work this job with really very stressful work environment and shifts. So sleep deprivation was actually very common for me. Physical exertion, yes, it used to be, as in exercise intolerance. And if I do too much physically, still I might get a migraine, or also accompanied by muscular pain in the extremities. altitude, low oxygen, tension, yeah. I don't know about that. And the menstrual cycle, oh yeah, gosh. That every fucking month triggered the migraine. Sometimes twice. Before and after. Every time. It was so annoying and debilitating. Yeah, so this is predictable as migraine triggers. Periods of relative relaxation after a period of stress seem to be times of risk as well. Saturday morning or holiday migraines. Although a number of studies have noted an increased incidence of childhood physical and sexual abuse in migraine, one really cannot categorize this common condition along with the regulatory syndromes that we have just discussed. In part, trauma in some people may represent a switching on of the migraine gene in childhood. But a more likely explanation would be that the intrinsic autonomic dysregulation of trauma activates the genetically determined autonomic dysregulation of migraine itself. On the other hand, in treating thousands of migraine sufferers in my career, I have noted hundreds of patients with no family history of migraine who, after a severe life trauma, especially car accident, have developed typical, common or classic migraines. Yeah, for me it was probably both, genetically, because my mother had migraines, but also the stresses and trauma of life. Definitely. The migraines eventually subside with treatment, in some cases rather dramatically, with the use of somatically based trauma psychotherapy. Especially the reduction of stress. That was really a game changer for me, as well as changing my way of eating. Both. But my migraines really were very much stress based and still are. Post-traumatic migraine may indeed be another primary illness of disrupted autonomic regulation. Syndromes of procedural memory. These conditions are extremely common in the practice of the psychotherapy of trauma, and they often represent some of the most perplexing aspects of the case. Numbness, tingling, clumsiness, spasms, pain, tremors, twitches, stutters, hoarseness or cough, impaired swallowing, choking, dizziness, tinnitus, blurred vision, and localized weakness are typical examples of sensory and motor symptoms that may be based on traumatic procedural memory. Many psychotherapists have told me that when they consult their medical colleagues about these cases, the unusual physical symptoms are usually attributed to psychological processes or somatization, or simply don't make sense. They are usually dismissed as irrelevant, because these symptoms and behaviors don't seem related to any recent or past event that conceivably might have caused them. Yeah, and then you are told it's all in your head. They also may be shaped and distorted by the emotional content of the event that caused them, and consequently may appear strange or exaggerated. With a painstaking and thorough history of the patient's life experiences, one often finds that the particular symptom is clearly related to an obscure traumatic event. I mean, it seems just common sense, right? But what doctor takes the time to painstakingly and thoroughly ask for a patient's history? Usually they just give you 10, 15, 20 minutes of their time. In all of these cases, the symptom is not imagined or pretended, but rather represents a physiologic change in the areas of the brain that processed and stored in procedural memory the experiences of a specific area of the body during that traumatic event. In other words, syndromes of procedural memory are defined by their meaning.